our YouTube channel. Welcome. My name is Utku Texos. I'm an economist at the UN's Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, as well as one of the proud authors of the flagship report that we are launching at this event. And it is also my great privilege to be your moderator today. Our event today consists of three distinct parts. We have a brief opening session featuring our co-organizers at the principals level, and then this will be followed by a brief presentation of the key messages of the report delivered by one of my colleagues, Mr. Kavajoy Kachumuise, and then this will be followed with a very rich technical panel discussion. Please note that we have live interpretation on our side event in English and French. Now, without further ado, I would like to move on to the opening session and pass the floor to Ms. Cristina Duarte, the Special Advisor on Africa and the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. And although she needs no introduction, it's customary to say a few words at the beginning. Ms. Duarte joined the UN in 2020 as a Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Africa. And prior to joining the United Nations, she had extensive experience both in the financial sector and across the continent as a policymaker. She held the position of Cabo Verde's Minister of Finance, Planning and Public Administration for a decade from 2006 to 2016. She has held also senior advisory and board positions to many international organizations, notably including President Kagame's Advisory Committee on African Union Reforms, the Board of Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, and the Board of the Institute of African Leadership for Sustainable Development. Ms. Duarte, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Utku. Good afternoon from Niamey. My dear colleague Antonio Pedro, I believe the other open remarkers, let's say in this way, I don't know if they are on board, but I would like to greet to everybody, protocols observed. Allow me to deliver my remarks. I have around, let's say, 6 or 7 bullet points that I believe are critical when discussing financing for development, and within financing for development, trying to position domestic resource mobilization as the game changer. This is a narrative that OSA has been promoting in a strong way. I can say that we start in 2021, and the Secretary General's report to the General Assembly, I would say the 2022 edition, is only about domestic resource mobilization, a primacy role within financing for development in Africa. This is one, I would say that domestic resource mobilization is definitely one of OSA's priorities within our strategic agenda. The first message that I would like to convey here is that, contrary to the common perception, Africa has a short-term liquidity challenge, but does not face a solvability issue. And we need to make these distinctions. When we see debt suspensions, debt reliefs, negotiations and agreements and facilities, we need to understand that these facilities are welcome to address Africa's short-term liquidity, but does not indicate that Africa has a solvability issue, on the contrary. So, second message that I would like to convey here is that Africa generates financial flows, but has been unable to mobilize financial flows. Again, we need to make this decision. The capacity, the ability of the continent generating financial flows, and its inability to mobilize them. The best example is the illicit financial flows, the $88 billion of illicit financial flows. Is the proof that Africa has the ability to generate $88 billion? Because if Africa loses on an annual basis $88 billion, meaning that upstream, Africa has been able to produce them. So Africa has produced $88 billion that unfortunately has been completely unable to mobilize them, and of course has been losing them. So this is again a very important distinction, because the ability of Africa generating illicit financial flows in that amount, for example, the ability of Africa generating more than $1.3 trillion in African pension funds, it's a proof that Africa does not face a solvability problem. But the inability of Africa mobilizing these funds, yes, proves that Africa faces a liquidity problem. So the question that we need to ask is, what have you been missing? What are the reasons behind this paradox? The ability of Africa generating financial flows out of their powerful economy, but unable to mobilize them in a such way that put Africa in a situation of begging for debt reliefs and debt suspensions. So the third issue that I would like to bring to this conversation, of course, is that failures to address this paradox, let's say, as I mentioned, is at the heart of the liquidity problem in Africa, and of course associate to all the narrative about debt stress across the continent. So I do believe that this paradox calls for a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift that, in my view, should start in terms of mindset. So we need to be able to undertake a paradigm shift at a mindset level, so that we can translate the shift in mindset in more impactful, let's say, policy making in Africa. There is the idea that Africa relies, the first thing that we need to change in our mindset is the idea that Africa relies heavily on ODA and FDI. This is not the reality. As we speak, and we have analyzed in a very clear way in the report, as we speak, Africa already financed its own development. And the figures that also has been able to put in the report are very simple. If we add domestic revenues and private savings, we got $800 billion, but on the ODA side, the flow is only $55 billion. So the ODA flows and FDI flows together are smaller than the illicit financial flows. So to put things in perspective, so Africa already financed its own development, and I believe that this idea of Africa financing its own development should be a good starting point in the process of shifting mindset and changing paradigm. If we go, for example, the fourth message that I would like here to convey is regarding ODA and FDI. Despite their marginal role, they still be critical flows. But they can have a much more impactful delivery. Everybody knows, African policymakers, even our partners, that ODA experience and faces a huge challenge of effectiveness. As you speak, this is an issue that has not been addressed, ODA effectiveness. We have been talking about ODA effectiveness, if I can remember, in the past 25 years. We might have an opportunity, a win-win situation in terms of combining the decision of putting domestic resource mobilization at the primacy level and increasing the effectiveness of ODA flows. Because when we talk about giving the priority to domestic resource mobilization, of course, we are talking about supporting African countries in building strong countering systems. We are talking about supporting African countries in building strong domestic resource mobilization. Maybe this supports supporting African countries building strong domestic resource mobilization might be the gold opportunity to increase the rate of return of ODA flows. Because as I said, ODA faces an effectiveness problem. So the idea that I hope we'll be able to advocate in a stronger way, why not earmark ODA flows to help African countries, let's say in 5-year time, to have strong DRM systems. The fifth message that I would like to clarify here, I think it's important based on the reactions that I have been receiving from my UN colleagues, professors, etc. When we advocate a primacy role to domestic resource mobilization, I would like to clarify here that we are not approaching these from an accounting standpoint. No, it's not an account. So the expectation is not that domestic resource mobilization will provide each and every penny that Africa needs. This is impossible. There is no country that has implemented a long-term economic and development strategy without using debt. There is no way. So when you advocate for strong domestic resource mobilization, is essential from a political economy standpoint, because strong DRM systems create bigger policy spaces. What is missing now in Africa? Bigger and wider policy spaces just result in a situation where governments can better decide the best way to finance their own fiscal deficits. When a government reaches a level where he has the policy space to decide the best way to finance its own fiscal deficit, means that that same government starts enjoying higher levels of ownership. Higher levels of ownership will result in a better control of economic flows. And when a country controls better its own economic flows, that same country is in a position to change, to improve, to reshape the risk profile of that country, putting that same country in a better position to tap international capital markets. So instead of issuing euro bonds for a very short grace period, for a very short maturity period with a high interest rate, that same country will be tap international capital markets in a better The seventh message that I would like to vehicle here is very well, domestic resource mobilization. But the R stands for resources, not revenue. So it goes beyond tax revenues. And we have been advocating, and it's clear in the report, when tackling a certain DRM system in a country, based on my experience as Minister of Finance, the best way to start is by addressing inefficient public spending. Inefficient public spending in Africa is a huge problem. As we speak, it reached around $70 billion, almost 3% of Africa's GDP. This is huge. So this is the first, I believe, the first step. The second step is regarding tax revenues, tax revenues efficiency, not only in terms of the tax the fiscal policy, so the tax level, corporate tax, income taxes. But more important in Africa is the tax base, and this is crucial. And one of the low-hanging fruits to increase your tax base sometimes is by changing, rationalizing your tax incentives, making your tax incentive not only available to FDI flows, but also to local private sector, not only to big companies, but to small older companies, to small and medium enterprises. In the case of Cape Verde, for 2 decades, tax incentives were essentially taken by FDI, by the foreign direct investment. We made a huge reform in a such way, even a woman that decides to produce jam, for example, banana jam, something like that, she was entitled to enjoy tax incentives. Third, of course, is the huge liquidity that is outside continent, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, you name it, international reserves, that could play a critical role of unlocking Africans' financial markets, Africans' capital market at the national and regional level. So these are, I believe, some of the messages that together, all African voices, we need to come together to create a very bold narrative to influence the allocation of resources, to see if in the next 5 years there are some resources made available to finance, to support the building of strong DRM systems, domestic resource mobilization systems in Africa. Utku, I stop here. I don't want to take more time. I hope I was clear, and the floor back to
Thank you very much, Ms. Duarte. This was a very clear and concise, as well as a comprehensive tour d'horizon. It set the stage for our discussions in a very complete way. Now, if you allow me, I would like to move to our strategic partner, ECA. Mr. Antonio Pedro is here with us today, so we're privileged to hear from him in a minute. He is, in fact, a geologist by profession, with more than 40 years of experience in development issues and management at national, sub-regional, and continental levels. He joined the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in 2001 and has held senior level posts in various regional offices and departments of ECA since then. He was appointed Deputy Executive Secretary in 2021 and has been acting Executive Secretary of ECA since September 2022. Prior to joining the UN, Mr. Pedro had extensive experience in both public and private sectors in Tanzania and Mozambique. Mr. Pedro, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Utku. So let me go a little bit more traditional here. Excellencies, Ms. Cristina Duarte, and the Secretary General, UN Special Advisor on Africa, Mr. Jamel Gribi. Sorry, just 1 second, if you don't mind. 1 second, sorry. I'm sorry. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you today at the regional launch of OSA's flagship report. Please allow me to bring my remarks by congratulating Ms. Cristina Duarte and her team for the publication of this highly insightful report. At a time when global financial conditions are tight, many African countries struggle to service their debt, and the global economic outlook is pessimistic. The author report could hardly have been chosen a more relevant, author could hardly have chosen a more relevant topic for their flagship report. The question of how we can close the huge SDG and climate action financing gap is on our minds, and it is our generation's key responsibility. And earlier, the USG has articulated some of the foundations for us to address this issue. My remarks today are structured around one core theme, which is captured very well in the report. Boosting domestic resource mobilization is a systemic change process, a mindset, as Ms. Christina has indicated earlier, a mindset change is required for us to achieve this. The reforms needed to mobilize more resources have the potential to transform economies and livelihoods in profound ways, creating a variety of core benefits. I would like to illustrate this by focusing on three such transformations linked to the topics discussed in the report. First, going digital. Second, rethinking approaches to attract foreign direct investment. And third, getting fair compensation for ecosystem services. On the first point, going digital, I would like to suggest the following. First, recognize that many African governments have been eagerly adopting emerging digital technologies over the last decade to address inefficiencies in tax collection and management with often impressive results. In Rwanda, for example, the number of taxpayers doubled between 2011 and 2020, largely thanks to the digitization of the tax system. The introduction of electronic billing machines in 2013 has reduced the time it takes business to file VAT returns from 45 hours to less than 5 hours. Building such digital tax systems requires investment in internet access, digital literacy, and mobile money, leading to a variety of core benefits for a country's development. Certainly, Rwanda should not be an isolated case of the successful deployment of digitization for effective tax administration. The change must happen across the continent.
Sur le deuxième sujet, repenser les modèles des approches pour attirer les investissements directs étrangers, je voudrais souligner que dans le rapport et confirmé par les recherches effectuées aussi par la CIA, la pratique courante consistant à utiliser des incitations fiscales pour attirer les investissements directs. Déjà, Madame Duarte a parlé sur ça, la nécessité de nous orienter aussi vers les investisseurs domestiques, locaux et nationaux. Les pays doivent évaluer et surveiller soigneusement les coûts et les avantages de ces incitations, notamment en ce qui concerne leur impact sur les petites et moyennes entreprises locales, PME, et les efforts d'industrialisation. Des études montrent que les pays peuvent attirer plus efficacement les investissements directs étrangers en renforçant l'état de droit et en investissant
dans le système éducatif pour développer les compétences de leur main-d'œuvre. Il va que de soi que ces stratégies présentent des avantages connexes concernant les efforts dans un pays dans le domaine du développement durable. À la CIA, nous sommes convaincus que des politiques intelligentes en matière de contenu local, des programmes nationaux de développement des fournisseurs bien exécutés peuvent permettre aux investissements directs étrangers de mieux servir pour la transformation structurelle de l'Afrique et pour l'émergence des PME locales compétitives. Permettez-moi maintenant d'aborder le troisième et dernier point, à savoir obtenir une compensation équitable pour les services écosystémiques. L'Afrique arbitre un riche capital naturel, comme le bassin du Congo, qui contient certaines des plus grandes forêts tropicales humides du monde. La CIA a travaillé avec des partenaires pour mettre en exergue que le seul recours à la séquestration naturelle de carbone permet aux pays africains de fournir jusqu'à 30% des besoins mondiaux de séquestration. L'Afrique doit être indemnisée pour le rôle qu'elle joue dans la sauvegarde du climat.
It looks as if we have some connection problems with Mr. Pedro. Mr. Pedro, the floor is still yours, sir. You're muted.
Hello. So
Yes. Sorry, you froze for a minute or two when you were on your third point.
So let me. Sur le deuxième sujet, repenser le modèle des approches pour attirer
les investissements directs étrangers. Non, I think I've covered that. Permettez-moi maintenant d'aborder le troisième dernier point, à savoir obtenir une compensation équitable pour le service écosystémique. L'Afrique arbitre un riche capital naturel, comme le bassin du Congo, qui contient certaines des plus grandes forêts tropicales humides du monde. La CEA a travaillé avec des partenaires pour mettre en exergue que le seul recours à la séquestration naturelle de carbone permette aux pays africains de fournir jusqu'à 30% des besoins mondiaux de séquestration. L'Afrique doit être indemnisée pour le rôle qu'elle joue dans la sauvegarde du climat. À $120 par tonne de carbone, les crédits de carbone basés sur la nature pourraient générer 82 milliards de dollars par an, soit 1,5 fois le niveau de l'aide publique au développement reçu par l'Afrique en 2018. Tout cela permettrait des investissements durables, innovants dans la nature et en faveur du peuple africain. C'est un point que nous avons souligné lors du forum des entreprises africaines intitulé « Faire fonctionner le marché du carbone pour l'Afrique » que la CEA a organisé le 20 février dernier à Addis Ababa, en Éthiopie. Let me conclude by emphasizing the opportunities that lie ahead of us, despite the difficult times we are facing. The OSA team carefully chose to focus this report on domestic resources than just revenue mobilization. African resources are immense, but require the right systemic transformations to be mobilized. At ECA, we stand ready to work with the OSA team, the African Union, and other key partners to convert the ideas raised in the report into action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pedro, for this insightful intervention and also for highlighting the systemic nature of this change process that is required in Africa. The 3 points that you have raised are no doubt very pertinent, and we will also continue the debate touching on some of these things when we move to the panel discussion. So moving on, we've had some technical issues in bringing our colleague from African Union, Mr. Jamal Grip. He is trying to clear his conflict and join us as soon as possible. It looks unlikely that he'll be able to make it in the opening session, but we are going to revisit that towards the end of the program, either after the presentation or at the very closing. So we'll certainly hear from the African Union, one of our strategic partners. Now, allow me to, in the interest of time, oh, Mr. Grip, I think he has joined us. Mr. Grip, if you are with us, we are prepared to. Fantastic timing. This is fantastic timing, sir.
Hi.
Delighted to have you on board. You've just joined as I was about to move on to the next section. We are delighted that you could join us. Allow me to briefly introduce you and pass the floor on to you. So we are fortunate enough today to have a Mr. Jamal Grip, who is the Director for Economic Development, Trade and Integration of the African Union. Mr. Grip has over 20 years of diverse experience in the field of development and finance, including periods at the United Nations, UNIDO to be precise, various senior level appointments at the African Union, Islamic Development Bank, Islamic Cooperation for the insurance of investment and export credit, as well as a long stint at the private sector. Mr. Grip, the floor is yours, and may I request my colleague to stop sharing the screen so that Mr. Grip can use the platform? Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Thank you very much. Allow me to go straight to the point of my very succinct statement. So, Excellency Ms. Cristina Duarte, Head of the UN Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, Excellency Antonio Pedro, Acting Executive Secretary to UNECA, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm very pleased to participate to this strategic conference aimed at building robust partnership among various stakeholders responsible for tax issues at a national, regional, and continental levels in an effort to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals under the theme Financing for Development in the Era of COVID-19, the primary of the domestic resource mobilization in Africa. Let me re-emphasize that the African Union priorities is in line with this item agenda, which is central to realizing the African Union Agenda 2063, a roadmap for structurally transforming Africa. Attainment of this continental development blueprint is centered around deepening domestic resource mobilization through strengthening Africa's tax administration and curbing illicit financial flow, and enabling building strong partnership amongst ministers of foreign affairs and finance, tax administration, and other stakeholders is pertinent in strengthening revenue collection through robust, resilient, and sustainable tax administration. Africa should leverage tax to support its development. The first issue really is really the tax to the GDP, and I'm quite sure that His Excellency Pedro has already covered and enlightened the August audience about it. But let me just try to recap it in a few words. So according to the revenue statistic in Africa, the average tax to GDP ratio for 31 countries that provided data to the publication, to our publication, was 16.0% in 2022, a decrease of 0.3% point relative to 2019. Africa 31st average in 2020 is below the average of Asian and Pacific economies, which is 19%. Latin America and the Caribbean is 21%, and the OECD 33.5%. The tax to GDP for Africa is insufficient to finance the realization of the SDGs and spur inclusive growth and sustainable development. In that regard, building and bolstering the capacity of tax administration is imperative to ensure effective and efficient tax system. So several countries are part of the OECD G20 inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting BEPS, which has adopted 15 measures to tackle the tax avoidance, improve the coherence of international tax rules, and ensure a more transparent tax revenue. So allow me now to jump. The statement is 5 pages, but I would like just to summarize in the key role that AUC now African Union is trying to tackle the issue of the DRM. So the first one, one of the flagship projects is the multi-donor action on illicit financial flow. So the project objective was really to curb IFF for a period of 4 years until 2025. So the multi-donor action is financed by the European Union and German Federal Ministry of Economic Development and Cooperation, BMZ, in the government of Finland, and implemented by the GIZ through a good financial governance program. So the project identified the collaboration with this important flagship project is done through a steering committee, which has already met twice, and which identify the work plan among all the organs that are related to, that are fighting the curbs, fighting the IFFs in Africa. So we have come up with our roadmap. We are now implementing the roadmap related to the multi-donor action on illicit financial flow. So this is one. The second one is strengthening the Africa tax administration, which I tried to allude in my opening remarks. And this one is done through the initiative is aimed to strengthen the domestic resource mobilization by widening revenue of the continent from from the tax point of view. The activities include support and provide capacity building to the EU member states in strengthening tax administration, provide a platform for EU member states to exchange experience on bolstering tax administration, and facilitate exchange of information for tax purposes. Develop an African position on critical when negotiation for favorable global tax for Africa at the international at the international forum. Sorry. So this one is aiming. So this one is done. So this important project, flagship project, is done with the Africa Tax Administration Forum, ATAF, and the Department of International Development, the government of the UK. So this is again an important flagship project. The Specialized Technical Committee, our technical committee, the STC, which is a conference, ministerial conference, has established an STC on the has established a subcommittee on STC and on tax and elimination of IFF. So this is an important again achievement which was done at the African Union side. So we come up with the new structures and it's called and the subcommittee related to the AUC. So the third one is the African position on asset recovery, CAPAR. And this one is an initiative which led by our colleagues in the PAPS, is Political Affairs and Peace and Security. So they are the one who are leading and we are partnering with them. So this is part of, so there is the African Development Bank, the United UNECA, coalition, Coalition for Africa, Africa CODA, are the main stakeholder of this consortium, and we are part of it, and we are working with the PAPS in order really to come up with not only a position, but coming with the procedure and process and procedure that will lead the African Union Commission and the member countries that were affected by the asset, the issue of stolen asset, how to recover them. So this is something that is in the heart or really of our African Union. The fourth one is illicit financial flow in extractive industry. And I think, again, this is an important flagship project that we are now working with the UN, UNECA, and OECD. So this is, again, something that we are giving a very high importance, where we are trying through the African Union Commission really to identify sector by sector, especially the extractive one, the issue really related to the illicit financial flow, and how can we adopt a position that we curb the IFFs at this very specific really sector. So we are again working, the Commission, the OECD jointly organized a meeting with some member states in commodity trading to share experience and determine a way to strengthen really this important. The fifth one is transparency and exchange of information for tax purposes. So the initiative is aimed really at the reinforcing the DRM by addressing tax avoidance and evasion. Again, this is an important flagship project that we have been working and collaborating with the Global Forum, which is under the OECD and ATAF and the African Development Bank, the World Bank. These are again something very important for us. It's related really to the DRM, and again how to work with the Global Forum, how to make that automated exchange of information between the countries. So the countries, those where the multinational companies are operating, like in Africa, and those how they are reporting their financial data to the home country. And through that exchange of automated information, we have been able to find out some discrepancies, between the data, and this is where we are coming with the reconciliation exercise, where some of the funds they were flown from an illegal point of view. They were flown to OECD countries, and we are trying to repatriate those illicit financial fraud through this one. And I'll stop here. So these are the 5 main really initiatives that African Union Commission is working hand to hand with our stakeholder, really in order really to increase to curb the IFFs. And by curbing the IFFs, we are trying, of course, to increase the DRM, and of course, by how to strengthen the DAX administration and the remaining key stakeholders, the central bank and of course, the private sector. Let me just conclude by saying, in a nutshell, the DRM remain one of the main important policy that the African Union Commission is trying really to tackle efficiently through different channels. As you see, there are, as I mentioned, there are 5 initiatives, flagship, but as you can, it's a multi-dimensional issue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grip. I think we are having some technical problems with the connection.
Hello. Hello. Just in a nutshell, just to summarize it, if you allow me just to summarize it. So for me, it's an issue, it's a multi-dimensional issue. The report which was launched by the UN is very, very important. It comes really at the right time, and we need really to work in the collaborative manner. It's from African side, from the member states, the African member states, this is a collaborative work, but between the African and the rest of the world, that we are, of course, working. It's not only related to domestic, it's not an issue related to the domestic, really, it's a multi-stakeholder, multi-dimensional, issue that requires the African member states one side, the African or the African member state, the African Union as a coordinating body, the African side, all the African member countries we need to collaborate all together. But the most important is how to collaborate with the rest of the world. OECD from one side, UN is another side. As you may know, the last decision to come up with a new UN framework on tax is very important. Is something that came new. It's a new initiative that was launched by the African ambassadors led by Nigeria in New York. This is an important step toward really reviewing putting aside the remaining frameworks, especially the OECD one, but how can we build on those existing frameworks to come up with a new system, more equitable and more transparent from the African side. Let me stop here. And again, thank you very much. We still remain for any questions. And again, thanks, and wishing you fruitful deliberation and discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grip, for this very, very insightful and thorough presentation. Not only have you touched upon some of the very important technical issues that are coming out of this report, but you've enriched our discussions by highlighting African Union's flagship projects and initiatives, and therefore brought us really at the intersection of research and actionable policy recommendations and policy making, and completed the picture. And in fact, you've also highlighted one of the key strengths of the report, that is the nature of the partnerships, the comprehensive nature of the partnerships. You need new, stronger, and innovative partnerships. And thank you so much also for ending on this very, very pertinent point. So we are slightly behind schedule, so please allow me to move on to the presentation of the report. My colleague, Mr. Kavakacu Moises, Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the UN Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, will be presenting the report. He's also technically supervised the preparation process. Kawa, in the interest of time, we have about 10 minutes for this presentation, so please take it away.
Okay, Utku, can you hear me?
We can hear.
Okay. Thank you, Utku. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I will try to be very brief because my USG, Ms. Duarte, has covered extensively some of the issues raised in the report. Now, let me start by answering the question, why the focus on financing and domestic resource mobilization in particular. An African proverb reminds us, and I quote, "Every head must do its own thinking," unquote. I couldn't agree more with these age-old words of wisdom. If there's anything that COVID-19 pandemic has taught us, is the importance of African countries looking out for themselves. The pandemic has reshaped the financing landscape for Africa in a profound way. The IMF estimated in 2021 that Africa would need between 518 to 719 billion in additional financing for investment in key areas just to place the continent back on its pre-COVID growth trajectory in 2025. On top of that, the war in Ukraine, combined with the effects of climate change and energy, has led to high levels of food insecurity. All these crises have once again revealed the vulnerability of African economies to external shocks. Therefore, to strengthen its resilience, Africa must break with the past and look within, relying on its domestic resources for sustainable solution to its development. Putting DRM in the driver's seat would require addressing several challenges and paradoxes in the current national and international financial systems. These include, 1, improving the quality of public expenditure, 2, strengthening revenue collection, 3, harnessing private savings and private financial sector for development, 4, tackling illicit financial flows, and 5, strengthening partnerships. Now, with respect to improving the quality of public expenditure, now, most of the discussion on domestic resource mobilization tend to focus on the revenue side of the budget. But our report argues that in the context of Africa, priority attention ought to be given also to the quality of public expenditure. Africa suffers from poor public expenditure, which diverts resources away from the budget. Analysis from the IMF shows that African countries are relatively inefficient compared to other developing countries, with the average efficiency score of around 0.585 for Africa compared to 0.850 for non-African countries, with 1 being perfect efficiency. Losses due to inefficiency amounted to 12 billion for education, 28 billion for health, and 30 billion for infrastructure, which represent around 2.9% of Africa's GDP in 2020. The report argues that digitization of tax collection system could help boost domestic resource mobilization through improving transparency. And the USG for ECA, Mr. Petro, did also touch on that. And of course, countries that have gone that road like Rwanda, Ethiopia, have reaped substantial benefits in terms of revenue collection. The report therefore argues that the starting point for any domestic resource mobilization strategy in the context of Africa should not focus on raising taxes, but rather identify potential areas of savings from the budget. Now, in terms of revenue collection, as we can see from those charts, Africa has made progress over the last decade with tax GDP ratio rising from 14.8% in 2010 to around 16.8% in 2019. However, Africa lags considerably behind other developing countries. The comparable figure for Asia Pacific was around 23, and for Latin America and the Caribbean, around 21%. Because of the efforts that have been made, and as the USG indicated, African countries are now largely financing their own development, with private savings and public revenue now accounting for more than 80% of total financing in 2020. Despite this, the tax base still remain narrow, and given the regressive nature of the tax system, the burden of taxation falls on very few, mainly individuals and small and medium enterprises. In this regard, unleashing the potential role of the financial sector to provide additional financing for critical investment will be indispensable. However, due to the shallow nature, the financial sector in Africa has not been able to play an effective role in saving mobilization. If you look at all the measures of financial development, for example, the ratio of domestic credit to the economy, it is low. For Africa, it was only 30% compared to 54% for Asia and 45% for Latin America and the Caribbean. Furthermore, national and regional development banks have not been able to play an important role in terms of providing long-term financing to productive sectors, i.e. manufacturing and agriculture. The report identifies the growing pension fund market as an important untapped source that could be leveraged for SDGs financing. Pension funds assets have grown over the years from 676 billion in 2017 to 1.1 trillion in 2020. For some countries, such as Namibia, they exceed total amount of GDP. However, most of the pension funds assets are invested abroad. The case of Botswana and Namibia are quite illustrative, where over 2/3 of pension funds assets are invested abroad. The report estimates that if African countries were able to invest an allocation of around 2.8% of their pension fund assets into infrastructure, similar to what the South African Pension Fund is investing, that would generate an additional 20.9 billion per year for infrastructure development, further reducing the infrastructure financing gap by 30%. Illicit financial flows are one of the absurdities of the current global financial system. It is paradoxical that a continent with a large financing gap is at the same time an exporter of capital to the world. According to UNCTAD, illicit financial flows out of Africa amounted to 88.6 billion in 2019, nearly twice the amount of ODA and 2/3 of FDI inflows. These not only represent a severe constraint on development and domestic resource mobilization, but also perpetuates global inequities. UNCTAD shows that by keeping illicit financial flows out of Africa, that could reduce the financing gap by 33%, releasing vital or much needed resources for investment in education, health, infrastructure, as well as to other productive sector. Chapter 5 of the report focuses on strengthening partnerships and identifies key partnerships at domestic, regional, and an international level. At the domestic level, the report underscores the importance of involving civil society organization and other key stakeholders in the development process, as well as the importance of modernizing tax collection system. At the regional level, the report identifies the importance of building partnership to facilitate cross-border infrastructure investment, which will be key to unlocking the potential benefits of the CFTA. And at the international level, the need to deliver ODA in line with existing international obligations, as well as addressing the effectiveness of aid. Also, the importance of addressing international tax cooperation through exchange of information among tax jurisdictions. The report provides a comprehensive list of policy recommendations, but in the interest of time, I will just highlight 3 key policy actions. One, the importance of rationalizing tax expenditure by eliminating unproductive fiscal incentives. 2, the importance of improving efficiency through adopting digitization. And lastly, the need to tackle illicit financial flows through addressing international tax cooperation. And here we take note of the progress that was made last year in the GA, the UN General Assembly adopting a resolution to address international tax cooperation. One hopes that this would culminate in the adoption of a comprehensive multilateral framework to address illicit financial flows and related issues. In conclusion, based on the analysis from the report, it is clear that Africa does not have a money problem, as demonstrated by our USG and Mr. Petro, as well as the representative from the African Union. The challenge for Africa is rather how to mobilize all the potential sources of funding for investment in SDG, as well as Agenda 2063. And prioritizing or putting domestic resource mobilization in the driver's seats will not only help the continent address or strengthen its resilience to external shocks, but also it will provide much needed policy space necessary to allow the continent to implement homegrown policies and initiatives. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Kava, for this presentation. And this brings us to the end of our second segment, and we are moving swiftly to our panel discussion. the final segment of the day. We are fortunate enough to have with us 4 distinguished panelists, and each panelist will address up to 2 questions for about 2 to 3 minutes each. I will introduce them briefly when they speak for the first time, and at the end we will try to set aside some time for audience questions. For the members of the audience who would like our panelists to address any questions you may have in your minds, please put them in the chat box and we'll try to get to it at the very end. So allow me to start with Dr. Mishek Mutize, and the first question will go to him. Dr. Mishek Mutize heads the African Union's support to its member states on credit ratings at the African Peer Review Mechanism, an organ of the African Union. So Dr. Mutize, one key takeaway from OSA's flagship report, as you know, is that the African countries are already financing the majority, almost 75% of their development needs through domestic resources, but more needs to be done to achieve the aspiration of Africans. As stated in Agenda 2063, African countries have committed to take full responsibility for financing their development. In your view, how can African countries achieve this goal, especially in the context of the current challenges that we are facing, including but not limited to COVID-19, climate-related emergencies, and the war in Ukraine? The floor is yours, sir.
No, thank you very much, and all protocol observed. Good afternoon to all the distinguished participants. So I'm glad that there's been a very solid foundation that has been laid on this discussion. And just to align my response to part of the work that we are doing at the African Peer Review Mechanism, is that there is no question that the financing using Eurobonds or foreign currency borrowing is unsustainable because of the cost that is involved, and also the evidence of the decline in the appetite for issuing bonds, because they are taking a whole lot of the government revenue. At the same time also, the lack of capacity from the government side to be able to raise enough revenue to meet that gap. So notwithstanding those challenges, the issue of a domestic borrowing has been the center of our response, where we are encouraging countries to do sustainable borrowing. And part of this is to address the underlying weaknesses in the fiscal structure of countries in terms of tax efficiency and efficiency also in particular to the collection of tax and broadening the tax base. So one of the areas that has been of interest is to ensure that there is a focus on improving domestic borrowing in various senses, one of which is for governments to utilize more of domestic ratings, and also where we don't see much of the problems that are faced with international credit ratings or long-term foreign currency ratings. So we have seen quite an interesting response in the very recent future, where in the very recent past rather, where countries like Nigeria have responded by listing most of its long-term bonds on its domestic security market, which was one of very a trend-setting move, because you find that it injects a significant amount of liquidity on the domestic market, and also it injects a lot of confidence, even to investors that are a little bit skeptical to borrow using the domestic currencies on these markets. And we have seen also a spike in the which we have been encouraging and working with countries to support that, a spike in the countries that are soliciting or engaging African-based rating agencies to issue domestic ratings to support what I've just said. And recently, of note, we have also been working with one of the rating agencies, which has been approved as a green bond verifier, which is a very significant step towards some of the green financing initiatives that are becoming more popular. So for now, let me pause there, and I'll be happy to respond if there is something specific that you might want me to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mutise. You've certainly shown a spotlight on one of the key areas that not only do we highlight in our report, but also is part of our research agenda and very much on the radar screen of almost all policymakers in Africa, on the credit rating agencies. I'm going to get back to you and my next question on some of the other APRM initiatives where you'll have a bit more time to elaborate. For now, I would like to move on to the issue of private savings in Africa and how to unlock them. And on this issue, we are going to hear from two of our panelists, Dr. Ghanem and Mr. El Hiraika, one after the other. Let me introduce them both to you briefly, and then I'll read the question and they'll take the floor one by one. First of all, Dr. Hafez Ghanem is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. He is also a part of OSA and ACBF's recently launched think tank network in that capacity. He has worked in over 40 countries in Africa, Europe, Central Asia, Middle East, and North Africa, Southeast Asia, and has over 40 years of experience in the field of development. He was an Assistant Secretary General at the FAO, responsible for economic and social development, and he was a Vice President at the World Bank, responsible both for the Middle East and North Africa region and the Sub-Saharan Africa region separately. In his capacity as the Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, we look forward to his contributions to our panel today, as well as longer-term contributions within our think tank network. The next panelist who's going to address the same issue is Mr. Adam El Hiraika. He is the Director of Macroeconomic Policy Division at the UNECA. He has over 30 years of experience in the field of development. Mr. El Hiraika joined the United Nations in 2004, and prior to joining the UN, he held senior positions at the private sector as well as the Islamic Development Bank. So very warm welcome to both of you. I would like Dr. Ghanem to go first and Mr. El Hiraika to follow if possible. And the question is the following. The continent generates substantial private savings in the form of pension and assurance funds as well as sovereign wealth funds. However, the institutional savings are not really harnessed towards financing the region's growth and development. What specific measures could be adopted to fully harness these resources towards financing for development, including for infrastructure development, which is critically needed in Africa today? So over to you, Dr. Ghanem. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning and good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for inviting me to join this very important discussion. Yes, you are right to say that Africa generates a lot of savings, but it is also true that we are not mobilizing enough of those savings, and we still have a huge savings investment gap of around 6% of GDP. Now, if we want really to improve the private savings, I think that we need to work on two sides of the balance sheet. First, we need to work on creating more opportunities to raise rates of returns on those savings. Let me explain. People will keep their savings in Africa and will use their savings to develop Africa if they see good projects with high rates of returns and lower risks. And in Africa, we have huge opportunities. Africa is we are the continent of the future in terms of natural resources, in terms of youth and energy. And so what is stopping those investments? What is stopping those investments is often bad policies, bad governance, weak institutions. So we need to work on that side of creating more opportunities for our private sector. And I would like to point out that we often talk about FDI, foreign direct investment. That is good. We need foreign direct investment. It brings in access to foreign markets. It brings in access to technology. But more important is to develop our own investment. And Africa has lots of big companies now and abilities. So this is the first area where I think we need to focus on, is to create the opportunities for better investment. Linked to that, and that's a point that you raised in the report, which I really liked a lot, is the importance of public-private partnerships. We need to invest a great deal in infrastructure, especially in energy. How can we develop our continent if nearly half of our population has no access to electricity? And those who have access to electricity have access to low quality electricity. So, and this is a sector where public-private partnerships work very well. The same thing in transport. So this is if we can bring in more private investment, more private savings, if we can develop more public-private partnerships. Now, no, one last point when I'm still talking on the side of rates of return on investments, which is for some reason, I think historical reasons and whatnot, the perception of risk in Africa is too high. There is a perception that investments in Africa are riskier than and those of us who know Africa, who live in Africa, we know that it is not that risky. But given those perceptions, I believe that we need to get also to work on risk reduction. And that is where some of the international development banks, like the African Development Bank or the World Bank, can help us in terms of providing guarantees and securities to investors. On this part is very important. The second part of in mobilizing domestic savings has to do with the financial sector. And one of the points that the report makes that I really liked a lot, because it is not often that we read about that, is the importance of mobilizing pension funds. And your report says pension funds are important in Africa for two reasons. They're going to be increasing because of the increase in the middle class, and because of demographics. We have a huge the youth bulge. So we really need to develop more financial instruments for investments by the pension funds. We have a banking sectors in Africa that is used to just lending short term. We need to support develop the banking sector in Africa, non-bank financial institutions. And one point that the report makes is the importance of Pan-African banks. We now have several large banks that work across the continent, and they are providing more services than the typical commercial banks that we are used to, and those need to be supported. And then I know I'm talking too much, so let me stop. But I just wanted to underline a point that is made in your report concerning pension funds, which is also the importance of the pension fund regulations, to allow the pension funds to invest more in infrastructure, for example. There are too many regulations in many of our countries limiting what pension funds can do. And as you say correctly, that in the future pension funds are going to become more important. Yes, you want to supervise the use of that money, but you do not want to limit it, and you want to provide them with opportunities to support development in our continent. Thank you very much. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghanem, for this very analytical dissection of those key points and the additional observations that you shared with us. Mr. Al-Hiraika, the floor is yours, sir.
Okay, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you. I would like to start by thanking OSA for inviting me to this lounge. And I would like to express also my congratulations to USG Christine and her team for a very good report. The report really strongly support and complement work we have done in ECA and in partnership with AU and some other partners within Africa on domestic resource mobilization. And I would like in particular to emphasize the point that the scope for domestic resource mobilization to increase and support growth and development in Africa is really huge. According to a recent economic report on Africa we produced, African countries have the potential to increase tax revenue, for example, by 12 to 20% of GDP. I will come back to that point, but on the question you have raised on private savings and especially pension funds, I think Mr. Hafiz Ghanim provided very good responses. I would like to just emphasize some of them. Pension funds are huge, and the issue, as Mr. Hafiz Ghanim correctly pointed out, is an issue of governance and institutions, and an enabling environment that will attract, that will address issues of risk and provide incentives for pension funds, for example, and insurance funds to be directed to long-term investment in infrastructure, energy, water, and the like. So what African countries, I think that a few examples of African countries that we have studied, such as Kenya, managed to mobilize and to make some good use of institutional savings by issuing, for example, pension infrastructure bonds, so that institutional investors can feel okay as far as risk is concerned, as far as incentives are concerned, to buy these bonds, medium and long-term bonds. So also African countries need really to work more on development of their financial markets, especially stock markets, that needs government intervention and government support in terms of regulation in particular, and in terms of creating an enabling environment for private equity markets, for stock markets in general, to expand. And African countries also need to work more on creating really a regional niche. Many countries now are interdependent and closely interdependent when it comes to trade, when it comes to even investment. So there is a potential for creating regional stock markets that will have larger scope for domestic resource mobilization within the region, and for creating, the kind of partnerships, new partnership models that can help, just like Mr. Ghani mentioned, that can help, new financial institutions, banks, for example, that operate beyond national borders. So I think these are the initiatives that can help us make better use, as Christine said, of the resources that we generate, but fail to mobilize. And overall, I think when I talk about governance and institutions, effective mobilization of domestic resources in general, including private savings, requires development plans. Governments need to have development plans that help them to identify priorities, to identify opportunities, to identify challenges, and to work on how to address the challenges and make use of opportunities. Those development plans should be underpinned by integrated national financing frameworks. And within that framework, we need to undertake numerous policy and administrative reforms. We have been working with a number of African countries on how to really learn from each other, just along the same lines mentioned by Mr. Karib, African countries really need support to operationalize ideas, to transform ideas into actions and policies. And I think learning from each other at the continental level is very critical. So I'd like to stop here. Thank you.
I would like to thank both of our panelists for those very pertinent observations. In fact, there was this, although they approached the topic from different perspectives, there was a significant overlap in their emphasis on governance and institutions in Africa, as well as the way to manage the risk, or rather the perception of the real risk, which deviates from the actual underlying risk, and the importance of regulation and development planning to unlock those investments, as well as the importance of partnerships. So this brings me now to our fourth panelist, Professor Teddy Sami, Director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, Carleton University. And we're also grateful to Professor Sami for being a member of OSA's knowledge network and has already made, and for the contributions that he has already made to the analytical work of our office. Professor Sami has been with the Norman Paterson School, serving in different capacities since 2003, and his current research focuses on domestic resource mobilization, fragile states, foreign aid, and deindustrialization and income inequality in Africa. His most recent books are called African Economic Development from 2018 and Exiting the Fragility Trap, Rethinking Our Approach to the World's Most Fragile States from 2019. So Professor Sami, you have a question on another aspect of domestic resource mobilization. Remittances have become an important source of financing for Africa's development, and they represent almost double the volume of FDI flows. However, despite their increased volumes during the last decades, they continue to be relatively untapped sources, and it is often expensive to send remittances. How can African countries leverage remittances and diaspora finance in general to contribute to their own growth and prosperity? The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Utku. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of today's discussion on domestic resource mobilization. I'd like to thank USG and Special Advisor on Africa, Ms. Cristina Duarte, and her team at OSA for producing a very important and timely report. Before I get to the actual question that I was asked, I do want to mention that this report is timely, important, but it's also important to remember that we have been actually talking about these issues for a while now. In fact, I went back to my historical notes that I had kept, and I was actually part of a DRM project which was conducted by the now defunct North-South Institute in Ottawa as far back as 2010. The project looked at challenges to increasing domestic resource mobilization and focused on 5 cases: Burundi, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Uganda. I was also part of a team that drafted the African Capacity Report in 2015 for the African Capacity Building Foundation, but I also looked at DRM and illicit financial flows. And those projects, I mentioned them because they highlighted many of the issues that we're discussing today and proposed a number of policy recommendations that actually align with what the OSA report is recommending. In fact, as some of you may remember, as far back as 2002, the Monterrey Consensus made improved DRM one of its leading actions. Why do I mention these historical elements? It's because I think we know that what many of the technical solutions are. They are not easy, all of them, because some of them require international collaboration and cooperation, but some of them can be done domestically. So I would say politically, we need the will to do that. And if we don't have this willingness to actually effect change, we might still be talking about the same issues 10, 15 years from now. So we know what many of these solutions are, and I think it's important to keep those in mind. What the OSA report does, of course, it brings all the various aspects and latest developments related to DRM together. It expands this notion of DRM to other important aspects, such as remittance flows and the role of diaspora, because some of the earlier projects that I was involved in focused largely on taxation, and then it was extended to IFS, but they never provided sort of a comprehensive overview of what these different issues are, and of course, how they are related to other financial flows. So I think, I'm glad that we're actually having this conversation in a very comprehensive way. So to come back to this precise question of remittances and diaspora finance and how they can better contribute to growth and prosperity, again, there's a lot of research that has been done on remittances in particular, not so much on diaspora finance, I would say. But as far as remittances, for example, the World Bank has been a leader on this with Dilip Rata, who's done a lot of work on this. I think we have better data, but there are still many data gaps when it comes to remittance flows. I think some of the numbers in the report that are mentioned clearly understate the true amounts that are actually coming into Africa. In fact, even in the report, it's mentioned that it's probably more than double what we know, right? So I think there's that question of formality and informality, which I will gladly address if there's question around it. But I think we need better integration of remittances with local financial markets. I think this naive conceptualization that is just a person-to-person or personal transfers, we need to expand on that. Remittances are more than just personal transfers if we can harness their potential. So I think, if we can better integrate remittance flows with financial products to make people more included, as we know, this is a very important issue in the African context. It's the lack of financial inclusion. I think we need to be more creative and innovative in the remittance space than we currently are. The other thing that I would say, of course, is data, which I've mentioned. I think we need a better sense of the volume, the means which people are using to send money, and why they choose certain systems better than others. I think if the incentives are not aligned properly, even if you bring down the cost of transfers, people will still resist going through the formal channels. So we need to think more than just reducing the cost. We need to look at the incentive, the overall incentive structure for why people choose certain options over others. The final thing I would say is that in the case of diaspora finance, I think it's even more important for us to think more broadly about what this means, because diaspora don't contribute they can contribute in terms of resources, but I think they can also contribute in terms of the skills that they have, in terms of the ability to create networks between their host and home economies when it comes to trade and investment flows and so on. So it's not just a question of investing in their home economies, but it's also in terms of the expertise, the skills, the networks that they can create. And I think there's a lot of potential, and I have yet to see very good studies that actually look at what works and what doesn't. So for example, we know, and I think some of these countries are mentioned in the report, we know some countries have been more sort of leaders in that domain, where they've issued diaspora bonds. There are other countries that are not discussed in the report, but that have been, for example, creating incentives for the diaspora to invest back in their home country. So tax incentives when you retire. In some cases, it's even, for example, you can bring a duty-free car with you if you want to retire and invest in your home country. Other countries have created what we call these brain banks. So this idea that you can register as a member of a diaspora into a database with your skills, knowledge, and expertise, that your home country will then call upon you whenever they need your skills and so on. So I think there's interesting approaches that have been developed, but I don't know what these have done in terms of their impact. And I think it would be helpful to see whether we can learn from some of these examples to see what works and what doesn't and why that's the case. So I have to say, I'll put my card on the table. I'm originally from Mauritius, which is a country that actually has been trying to attract its diaspora back to the country. But again, this is a good example. The reason why I mentioned this is because I don't know actually what impact this kind of policy has had. Because there is still, I think, when we think about Africa more broadly, there's sometimes a reluctance for the diaspora to invest, because I think, as some of the other panelists have clearly stated, if there's no incentive or if the risk is perceived to be too high, people will not do it, right? So you need a number of factors that are coming together for people to be willing to do that. And so I'd be interested in knowing more about some of these cases that have worked. In fact, I think we need to do more work on this to figure out why certain things work and others don't. So I will stop here because I don't want to take too much time, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sami, for that insightful intervention. This brings us to almost to the end of our meeting, and I'll propose a very quick scenario change so that we can get to hear from all our panelists for one last time. Instead of asking formulated questions that we've already discussed before, I would like to do a quick lightning round for 1 minute, 1 minute and a half observations from each panelist. And please, if you could also end with a concrete policy recommendation that we could take home from today's discussion, and use this opportunity to thank all our co-hosts and panelists for the valuable time that you have invested in this meeting today. And with that, let me move to Mr. Al-Hiraika. If possible, he's already got his video up. So your final thoughts and anything that we haven't touched upon that you would like to share with us today, Mr. Al-Hiraika. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Utku. Many thanks. I'd like really to go back to the question of tax incentives or tax expenditure. And because we have been working on this since 2010, we started to work on the issue of tax expenditure and illicit financial flows with African Union. And we are glad that the whole world came a long way really to have a more common understanding of the meaning of illicit financial flows, and to struggle also together on how to address illicit financial flows. So the question on tax incentives, tax incentives have been a waste, I think, of resources in Africa. According to an extensive, and the report presented by Kava alluded to that, an extensive 12-country study we undertook showed that Africa spends $20 in order to attract $1 more of investment. That is quite wasteful, and that investors consider tax incentive as factor number 12 in their investment decisions. So this is a complete waste, and I think, and a source of corruption and a source of illicit financial flows, because most of the companies that benefit from tax incentives are multinational corporations that operate primarily in the mineral sector. And these enterprises are really very difficult to manage. So they are a source. Tax incentive that attracts this kind of investment is a cause for illicit financial flows for a number of reasons. One, the dominance of multinational corporations that are difficult for African countries to manage, and African countries do not have the financial and human resources to apply international tax reform, tax norms. So this results in base erosion and profit shifting through aggressive tax planning. And we estimate that if we close this loophole of BEPS, Africa can generate the equivalent of 2.7% of GDP in terms of revenue. And second, because there is an over-reliance on corporate income tax. So, and these multinational corporations have the ability also to evade this kind of taxes. And so there is a need for new forms of taxes. And this together with effort by African countries to close loopholes and to do a cost-benefit analysis when it comes to when it comes to MNEs and to develop expertise to manage this sector. If African countries can do this together with other types of tax reforms, as tax policy and administrative reforms, we estimate that African countries can generate on average about 5%, the equivalent of 5% of GDP in terms of tax. So we are right now carrying out a very detailed study on this issue of multinational corporations and tax incentives. And this study we are carrying out with Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, and our preliminary report based on 10 country experiences shows that there is a need for better management of M&As and to stop harmful tax incentives, and also to do cost-benefit analysis when it comes to tax incentives. And there is a need for tax incentives, if any, to be better governed with specific time-bound incentives targeted at achieving specific objectives, and with reforms to stop abuse of tax incentives and to develop the governance and monitoring of tax incentives in Africa. So with this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Hiraika. Just to give the other panelists a quick opportunity to say a few closing words, let me move to Dr. Hafez Ghanem, please. Dr. Ghanem, please, we would like a concise intervention, a minute or so.
Thank you very much. I'll be very concise. One of the things that I really liked about your report is the focus also on the quality of public spending. I've read many reports on DRM in Africa, and they usually focus on taxation, sometimes on mobilizing private savings. But taxing to do what? And the importance of the quality of spending comes out very nicely in your report. And I really think that this is a very important point. The quality of spending, we can discuss two aspects of it. How are we allocating the spending, and what is the efficiency of the spending? In many of our countries, we borrow, we tax in order to finance non-essential spending that does not that is kind of wasteful. I don't know, new cities, big towers, or whatever. And that should be avoided. We need to focus on where we need to spend on education, on health, on social protection, on infrastructure. The second aspect of the quality of spending that also comes out very nicely in your report has to do with the waste in the spending, not to mention also corruption. And your report speaks very eloquently on the whole issue of public procurement. And the use of the need to use e-procurement, for example, to stop leakages, which is again a very important point that I would like to underline. Actually three footnotes, and I'll end quickly. When we talk about the quality of spending, also we need to look at the efficiency of spending. One of the sectors where we really need to focus on a lot is education, where the education is probably the largest chunk, takes the largest chunk of budgets of our countries. And yet, when we look at the quality of education in Africa today and the learning outcomes, it is very discouraging. And that is an important point to make. The second footnote I wanted to make is that I very much agree with Professor Sami that technocrats like us, we know the solutions, and we have been telling the politicians for a long time. What is missing sometimes is the political will, and maybe something that in your next report or your next analysis is how can we mobilize political will for reform of that sector in Africa. And finally, you said you should end with a policy recommendation. My policy recommendation is actually to emphasize the recommendation that Mr. Adam El-Hiraika made, which is we need to develop regional stock markets. I mean, we need to develop lots of regional things in Africa because our countries are so small. I mean, all of Africa, 1.4 billion people, is the size of India. So let us. If you want to really develop the stock markets, develop financial opportunities, I think that what Mr. El-Hiraika suggests is to maybe pick 1 or 2 or 3 big stock markets on our continent and develop them to serve the whole continent. And thank you very, very much again for giving me the opportunity to discuss this very interesting report.
Thank you very much. May I now go briefly to Dr. Mutize for a 1-minute wrap-up on your answer?
No, thank you very much. So for me, I'll be very brief. I think most of the issues have been mentioned, but I just wanted to touch more on the issue that, of course, we do agree that the perception of risk in Africa is quite pessimistic, and this has been very costly, and it has been proven as such. So as the appetite for investment in Africa remains, it's still significant, I think, and evidence point to that. So, but there are some structural weaknesses that investors usually worry about. And in some cases, you see governments postpone that by expressing willingness to pay high cost of borrowing. And that has been consistently showing or feeding into the unsustainability of debt. So as my parting shot and recommendation would recommend governments to obviously look into the structural weaknesses that investors or that leads to the perception of risk going up, because you can see that all the bonds that have been issued are issued or are oversubscribed. So that speaks to some inefficiencies in the process that governments can leverage on to the betterment of their people. So thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this discussion and for the wonderful report that you have put out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mutize, for being part of the panel today. And I would like to go to Professor Sami for very quick last-minute thoughts.
Just 2 points. One is I couldn't agree more with one of the highlights of a report being the quality of public expenditure. I think this is really, really crucial. In fact, I had this research project from a while ago, which I could never do because of lack of data, which was to look at what essentially are Africans getting back for the taxation that they put into the system. So things like education, health, better roads, infrastructure, because we don't have a good sense of what the dollars that people pay in taxes are being returned, how are they being returned, and whether it's efficient or not. I think we've all seen auditor reports every year in many countries, which, you know, will provide you a long list of waste and corruption, poor governance, and then these reports just sit on shelves and no one pays attention to them. So that, to me, is a really, really important aspect that needs to be examined, which is the quality of public expenditure and how we can avoid waste. The second thing I would say in closing is to really think beyond remittances when we talk about diaspora finance. Remittances are important, and I think they need to be harnessed better, but I think we need to also think about more than just remittance flows, but in terms of how the diaspora can contribute in terms of the skills that they have, the knowledge that they have, the networks, creating, you know, trade and investment linkages and so on, and how can they be incentivized to actually contribute better to their countries of origin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sami. This brings us to the end of the panelists. I see Mr. Grip has graciously stayed until the very end of the event, and he was also willing to say a few words at the end, I believe. So, sir, I'll give you the same 1 minute. We are already way over time, but we just want to hear from you once more.
Thank you very much. Thank you, really, moderator. I'd like just to go through few bullet points, just to conclude on this important. I think the first one it was very well again mentioned, the quality really of public spending, and I think here we need just to a little bit to separate the tangible spending with the non-tangible, which are the education, health, but tangible is infrastructure. So for me, I go back to the infrastructure, the non-tangible. These are very important key as a driver for economic development. Non-tangible, this is where we need really to build the trust and transparency between the government and those where we really with the collection, through the collection process. So for me, this is very important that whenever the levy or the tax is done, the beneficiary of those we will collect, they need really to see the result on the ground. They need to see a road built there, not that they have spent or they have been, of course, they pay their taxes, but there is no road, there is nothing, there is no infrastructure, there is no bridge. So for me, something which is very important is trust and transparency. This is very important. When you go about the incentives, again, incentives, I go with what Dr. Adam just mentioned, to go for a regional really approach. We need to avoid really having that very aggressive competition between the countries to attract the FDIs. This is something very important. I would go for a fair and equitable tax system there that we put to attract the FDI. What we have noticed in Africa, there are some countries that goes very beyond what is acceptable to attract the FDI. These are fiscal revenue losses in the media. And then once the multinational conclude that project or program, they just close and then they leave the country. So for me, a regional approach and the continental is very pivotal for me. This is what, going back about the remittances, and I agree with the remittances, diaspora called for financial inclusion, but how to do? We have some good cases, good, nice, interesting cases in Africa. One of them, Ethiopia, how they did it. So the solution is not standing there in the where our immigrants are sitting, but in Africa. How to do it is to bring those remittances in one basket towards some interesting, bankable, of course, project. For example, you want to build a building? No problem. Let us bring at least 20 or 30 immigrants through their remittances over a certain year, providing certain financial, of course, financing scheme, incentives for them to come to build that important building, like a real estate building, like 30 floors, not to go just to build their individual. And this is working. So it's backed by a bank, by the guarantee of the land, of course, but backed by 30 or 40 immigrants that working together towards same product, financial product, is to go and to invest in this real estate. And it gives results. And I really, if you come to Addis Ababa, you'll be astonished by all those buildings around. It's not built by one single, it's built by a diaspora sitting in the US, mainly in the US, UK, that are sending through their certain product to come and to. So this is something very important. The peer learning process between African, we have good. I think what we need perhaps is to come up really how to delineate how to come up with what we call categorization of those advanced country, those not advanced, and those, so how to categorize them and how to come up with more peer learning between them, how to bring those which are advanced in tax collection, in tax reforms, with those which are lagging behind, and how to bring those. This is what the African Union is trying really to do. And last but not least is really, I'll stop here. I have another final idea, but it has left. So thank you very much again. Thank you, really. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grip. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you and all our panelists for your generosity in sharing your time and experiences and wisdom with us in this platform. I won't even attempt to summarize our discussion. It has been a very rich, a very substantive discussion with pertinent policy recommendations. We are going to swiftly prepare a summary report of this meeting, and we'll share it widely. So once again, thank you so very much for joining us today, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Atam.
Okay, bye.